Thank you so much for your time, Reverend Dr. Dennis Edward. Here we have our assembly speaker, our Mosaic Mennonite Conference Assembly speaker for this fall, 2024. So, Dennis, could you introduce yourself to those who may not already know you?
Sure. Yes, so my name is Dennis Edwards, and I'm originally from New York City. That's where I grew up and did my schooling and all. I um I came to faith in a small storefront church in Queens, New York. Started to grow in my faith during my college years. I went to Cornell University, upstate New York, and I majored in chemical engineering. So I got an engineering degree, but I didn't work much as an engineer, but I became a science and math teacher in New York City. Got married, and eventually pursuing a call to ministry, went to seminary, came back to New York and planted a church in Brooklyn. That we did for a few years. The church never really grew that much, so we struggled a bit there. That's a different story. But then moved to Washington, D.C., and we're there for about 18 years. And it was in D.C. that we raised our four children. In D.C., I finished a PhD in biblical studies at the Catholic University of America right there in D.C. And I served the church on Capitol Hill that was founded by Myron Augsburger, Washington Community Fellowship. I served for several years, and then I planted another church called Peace Fellowship, which is still going on, some 22 years now.
Well, thank you. Dennis, what is your prior connection with Mosaic and Anabaptism?
Yeah, so I mentioned just now Washington Community Fellowship. That's um, when I came to that church, I was not as familiar with Anabaptism. Well, I was familiar, but not part of an Anabaptist denomination. So but I learned a lot there, and I transferred my credential into the Mennonite Church during that time. I um, I served, as I mentioned, a total of 6 years at that church, and then when I moved to plant a church, I worked with Steve Chris, and we became a partner in ministry, a partner in mission, I think they called it at the time, with what was then called Franconia Conference. So we, our church was affiliated that way with the Franconia Conference. This would have been around the early 2000s when we first started that church. I didn't mention earlier when I was introducing myself that I am a professor still of New Testament, but I mostly work as the seminary dean at North Park Theological Seminary here in Chicago. So I'm the dean of the seminary, and I still do some New Testament teaching and writing. But yeah, so I came into Anabaptism, had my credential transfer, became ordained in the Mennonite Church, and started out, I guess, in Virginia Conference when I was with Washington Community Fellowship, and then moved to then Franconia Conference.
Yes, our Mosaic Institute uses your book, Might on the
Yeah.
Margins.
Uh,
And can you tell us what inspired you to write that book?
yes, I mean, there are several factors, but the main one, I guess, would be that many times uh, people of color, and I would say in my case, African Americans, were asked to address issues of race and racism, and mostly to try to explain things to white people. And so we would spend a lot of our time trying to convince white people that racism is a real thing, and a lot of the arguments would be sociological. I saw mostly evangelical Christians dismissing those arguments because they weren't biblical enough for them. So I said, I'd rather not try to convince white people of something. What I'd like to do is encourage people who are already on the margins to know that we actually don't need to wait for white people to grant us any power or privilege or anything, but we can see that God has already empowered us. So actually the book is called Might from the Margins, because I want to say that that might is coming to us from the margins of our world, that there's power there that God has given. So it was born out of a lot of my experience as a pastor in and I will say in predominantly white settings, denominations, schools, and my experience as a pastor, but also my own interest in doing biblical exegesis. So that's kind of what gave birth to the book.
And then in your last book, you choose the topic of humility.
Hmm.
And why did you choose to focus on humility in your latest book?
Yeah,
How
yeah,
how is it essential to follow Jesus?
yeah. Thank you for that question. I had been thinking about humility a lot of my life. In fact, when I interviewed at Washington Community Fellowship, moving from New York down to DC, somebody asked me what attribute of Jesus stands out to you the most, and I thought it was kind of a odd question because I said, "Man, I love everything about Jesus." I wanted to say, but when I was pressed, I said, "Well, really, it's humility," and I guess it resonates with me for people to have power, but not use that power in an exploitative way, right? That there's something gracious about serving others with the power that you have. So when I thought about humility as the way of Jesus and that Jesus describes himself that way, I'd always been thinking about it. And then in conversations with a publisher, they said, "Well, Dennis, we'd like you to write about humility." So it gave me a chance to do that. So I see humility as a critical marker of Christian identity and the way of Jesus. So writing the book allowed me to explore that theme a bit more and look at a lot of the scriptural witness about it.
So as a peace church, as a Mennonite church, we tend to, you know, focus on our work on reconciliation.
Hmm.
And how does a posture of humility ground us when we navigate conflict?
Yeah, that's an important um, idea. I really think so. See, the way of the world is to always be hyper competitive, and we have to have winners and losers. I mean, that's the way when we think about when we watch the way the political landscape is playing out. Somebody's got to win, somebody's got to lose, and we see somehow our societies tend to gravitate toward that way. But that's not the way of Jesus. And the way of humility fosters peacemaking. Now, peacemaking doesn't always mean agreement on everything, but it at the very least means respect. So for me, humility means listening well, it means respecting others, and it's always keeping in mind that the Lord has a particular concern for the vulnerable. So if I come from that posture, then it allows me maybe to mitigate some of the tensions and conflict I might have. I'm thinking about the vulnerable, I'm thinking about respect, I'm thinking about my sisters and brothers and listening well. So those kind of postures kind of help me when I'm navigating conflict. I don't want to be too naive about it or overly simplistic because conflict is a big deal. I guess what I'm saying is oftentimes the way I see things happening in Christian settings and even outside of Christian settings is that in our hyper competitive spirit, we we almost lose sight of the humanity of the other person because in conflict, again, we have to prove how right we are and we have to win. And I'm saying if we can sort of step back from a moment and say, it's not about winning this thing, it's about how I witness the way of Jesus in this thing, then it helps me to, yes, I'm going to still stand up for what I think is right and true, but the way I'm going to do that is going to be more gracious. It's going to allow for more conciliation, more give and take, and hopefully a reconciliation.
Humility has been weaponized to justify continuing to marginalize to those who have been oppressed. How do you see humility as something liberating for all,
Mm,
including those who
mm.
have been marginalized?
Indeed, I do see it as liberating. But that's a really good point that you make because, when people are already at the bottom of society, those who have power tend to reinforce that, somehow even try to make it sound good, like God wants you to be in that place, and somehow there's this way of saying, well, you ought to be humble, and not look at themselves. So humility is something we're invited to practice. It's not something we're forcing on somebody else. I mean, we have to keep that in mind. It's something we're invited to practice, all right? So humility doesn't justify oppression. In fact, it should do just the opposite. It should be identifying oppression. Because if I'm humble enough to think about my sisters and brothers or my fellow human beings, it allows me to see what they're going through. The way I say it in the book is that humility is not about becoming a doormat. It's about thinking, why do we allow people to become doormats in the first place? Like, why would we have a society that does that? So I do think humility invites us to identify oppression, to work to dismantle it. And it's also liberating, as you said, because God's promise, and this is all throughout the scripture, God is he opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble, or shows favor to the humble. So there's something liberating in experiencing the favor of God, even when our circumstances are difficult and we're kind of working our way through them. There's still something about experiencing that favor of God when we work from a posture of humility.
Thank you so much. We
Thank
we
you.
are looking forward to have you
Oh,
speaking in our assembly. So one last question: what message from you should we anticipate for the assembly this fall with our theme "Walk Humbly with God"?
thank you. I'm very much looking forward to being with you all too. So I appreciate you saying it's the other way, but I'm excited to share with my sisters and brothers out in Pennsylvania. And I think the way I'm trying to describe humility is that I believe it can help transform our churches and eventually even elements of our society. I'm sort of naive enough to believe that, because I hope that humility can be this a genuine Christian identity marker. It was that way for our early sisters and brothers back in the first century, right? So I hope that my message in the fall will not only teach us some things about humility, but will encourage us to practice it even more as we sort of go against the grain of our society. Like we push against the hyper competitive nature of our society. That humility will allow us to I want my messages to encourage us to practice humility and have that posture of humility and be a real witness to our world.
Thank you so much, Dennis, for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thank you.
it.
Oh, I
All
really
right.
enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.